Yes, we're going to focus on this book here, The Great God Pan, by Welsh author Arthur Machen. Oh, that's funny, the author Arthur. But anyway, real quickly, let's talk about how we got here, why I'm making this video. One, Bob Dylan is tweeting now. There's been a lot of articles about that. And yes, it's been confirmed it's really him. And unsurprisingly, they are inscrutable. He gives a shout out to someone, publicly, who it appears doesn't exist. In this one here, he says, I ran into one of the Buffalo Sabres in the elevator at the Prague Hotel. They were in town to play the New Jersey Devils. He invited me to the game, but I was performing that night. That caused a complete separate hubbubaloo in the press. Sports Illustrated wrote about it. Yes, the Buffalo Sabres were in town in Prague, Czech Republic, at the same time as Dylan. And of course, then everyone is trying to figure out if that actually happened, and the press is asking the Buffalo Sabres, and they're investigating it. And their PR department made a funny video about the whole thing. The point is, his tweets are crazy. He's been at it for about a month. Even Saturday Night Live, SNL, they jumped on the bandwagon. So people are definitely noticing, and they're scrutinizing every one of his tweets. That takes us to the one where he name drops the book, The Great God Pan. He tells another hotel encounter story, but this time that he's in Frankfurt, Germany. It just happens to be a giant publishing convention going on. At the hotel in Frankfurt, there was a publishing convention, and every room was taken, parties all night. I was trying to find Crystal Lake Publishing so I could congratulate them on publishing The Great God Pan, one of my favorite books. I thought they might be interested in some of my stories. Unfortunately, it was too crowded and I never did find them. That's the tweet. Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. First, did this really happen? I don't know. But two, of course, people reached out to Crystal Lake Publishing, which did have representation at that event. Crystal Lake Publishing is, quote, a South Africa-based press specializing in dark fiction and horror. Their CEO said, we had literary agents in Frankfurt representing our books, so we weren't there in person. It's my understanding that they now have our contact info, so fingers crossed. And because of Bob Dylan's track record, I suspect nothing will ever come of this. But even if it doesn't, shouldn't they be incredibly grateful? Like, he just gave them more free publicity than they've ever had. And I'm sure it gave them some business. I know it did with me because I went and bought The Great God Pan from them because I wanted to see not just what is it, I wasn't aware of it. It turns out it's a pretty important, but I think really under the radar, Victorian horror novel. And more importantly, if I read the entire thing, would I find any clues to inspirations for Dylan songs or lines in Dylan songs? Because as far as I know, no one else was doing it, so I have, and that's what this video is about. It's not a long book at all. By the way, this here is the actual e-copy that I got from that publisher. It's a little over 21,000 words is all, and it was worth reading for its own sake. It's got some other big-name fans, by the way. Stephen King loves it. Who knew? He said it's one of the best horror stories ever written and maybe the best one in English. And H.P. Lovecraft was a huge Machen fan, and so I'm sure he was a fan of this book in particular as well. Kind of surprising, then, that the book has such a low profile. I mean, at least amongst us Philistines like me. But clearly it's no Frankenstein. It is, by the way, a direct descendant of that book, meaning it follows the mad scientist template Shelley invented. It obviously can't hold a candle in terms of recognition to Bram Stoker's Dracula either, or Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Regardless, Dylan name-checks it, and like I said, I went through it top to bottom, reading it, for the enjoyment of it, but with a subroutine running in my brain the entire time, which was a strange reading experience. Imagine reading an entire novel or a novella and trying to consciously remember every single sentence. Do you recognize anything here from so-and-so's, 40 albums of music? Now, I am going to mention things that are not clearly a direct possible connection, like, hey, this says X and the song says X, so there we go. Like, I'm going to be broader than that, but I'm also really limiting myself. Obviously, there's all kinds of accidental confluences you could try to put together. And also, it could be a case of Dylan seeing something of himself or his journey in the book, and it's not necessarily something reflected in the songs. So here we go. You don't even get out of the first page without the following quotation. I have heard myself called quack and charlatan and impostor, but all the while I knew I was on the right path. And why might that resonate with Dylan? And remember, it's at the very start of the book. Well, as a reminder, Joni Mitchell said, everything about Bob Dylan is a deception. And back at the time that there was that controversy, which controversy for Dylan? The one regarding the book Confessions of a Yakuza. Susanna Hoffs wrote a nice piece. You might remember that if you're a serious Dylan fan, and if you're not, I can't imagine why you're watching this video. Anyway, she closed that piece by saying something to the effect of how even if Dylan was presented with these questions, he would just choose to present himself as a thief in response anyway. And then, I know I've mentioned probably all of these examples, but my favorite cultural critic, Stephen Metcalf of Slate, said, Bob Dylan is a charlatan, and I mean that as the highest form of praise. And I'll recall further that wonderful vignette from Dylan's autobiography, which means we don't know if this actually happened or not, but regardless, where he says that early on in his career, like very early, somebody said, well, you're just a Woody Guthrie imitator, and somebody else has already done that better than you, and introduced him to the great Ramblin' Jack Elliott's music. I got to meet him, by the way, which was a thrill. I pretty much just had him sign a CD and moved along. But anyway, the point is, throughout Dylan's entire career, he's been kind of accused of charlatanry, so the line might have resonated with him. And then, especially keep in mind, it ends with, going back to the book's quotation, of course, called Quack and Charlatan and Imposter, but all the while I knew I was on the right path. And that reminds me of something Dylan said in a late career interview where he said, you have this future vision of yourself and you have to be careful who you share it with. So again, like knowing even very early on that you're on the right path. I say that all these are but dreams and shadows, the shadows that hide the real world from our eyes. There is a real world, but it is beyond this glamour and this vision. Dylan had a great song that he ever put on one of his, studio albums, original studio albums, if you will, Series of Dreams. And that's obviously, overwhelmingly likely to just be a coincidence, but what I like about this one, there's a twofer on this quotation. It also brings up something he was very specific about in his 60 Minutes interview. When, for reasons we'll skip, Ed Bradley asked him, who did you make that deal with? I'm not quoting exactly, I'm going from memory, but was this Robert Johnson deal with the devil kind of a thing? And Dylan was actually, in what he had just stated, which prompted that question, thinking the exact opposite. When he had said, I made a deal with it a long time ago. And so he answered Bradley's question by saying, kind of laughingly, in that wonderful, only Dylan could phrase it this way, the chief commander, as opposed to saying the commander-in-chief. He said the chief commander, and then Bradley asked something else, trying to push the point, because he knew he got struck gold here in the interview. Are you sure it wasn't the devil? Or who was it? And Dylan says something to the effect of, the person responsible for this world and the one we can't see. So definitely the exact same concept as in a book that Dylan is telling us is one of his favorites, but of course it can be found in any number of other places like Buddhism and, you name it. Next quotation from the book. You will think this all high-flown language, Clark, but it is hard to be literal. I don't even see that as a possible inspiration, just as something worth noting with Dylan's career, obviously his use of language, elevating rock and roll, popular music, songwriting, getting the Nobel Prize, the Pulitzer Prize, honorary doctorates in music, all that good stuff. I could just name awards all day long, right? Especially academic ones that separate him from the rest of his ilk. So that one's not even a Jungian synchronicity, just a pure coincidence, but still, wanted to bring it up. Next quotation. This one's a little bit closer to the mark here. And words of men flash forth to the sun and beyond the sun, into the systems beyond. And calls to mind, for us anyway, the song, great song, Chimes of Freedom, because of course it's the chimes of freedom flashing. And hey, if this really is one of his favorite books, it could be. That could have been the start to that visual metaphor. And maybe this line from the book popped into his head one night when he was looking up at the flashing lightning in the sky. Okay, next. This is a good one. In every grain of wheat there lies hidden the soul of a star. And we, of course, instantly think of his classic Every Grain of Sand. And, of course, there are other literary inspirations, potential ones, maybe much more likely ones for Dylan to have started his process, kind of kick-started it when he wrote Every Grain of Sand. William Blake being the big one. But wouldn't it be just classic Dylan to actually have plucked it from this much, much more obscure source? Or combining the two, Machen's Grain of Wheat and William Blake's Grain of Sand. Here's another one that I really like. If I was only going to pluck one out of everything I read, it would actually be this one. He stood face to face there with a presence. that was neither man nor beast, neither the living nor the dead, but all things mingled, the form of all things, but devoid of all form. Come on, we might have something here, right? Obviously, I'm thinking about the album Tangled Up in Blue and the wonderful song Shelter from the Storm. I came in from the wilderness, a creature void of form. Comanche said, I'll give you shelter from the storm. He pictures himself coming in from the wilderness like a beast, like an animal. And even in the book, it's like neither man nor beast, but just the fact that beast appears. And then I really think this is some phrasing that might have really caught Dylan's eye, right? The form of all things, but devoid of all form. Now, something I have to mention is I haven't gotten on my channel, of course, to reviewing every Bob Dylan song, so I'm touching on a lot of songs that I haven't done a video on yet, and as you might know, I go to ridiculous depths in researching each song, so when I bring up something like this, and hey, maybe that caused, this line from Shelter from the Storm, I haven't researched in depth Shelter from the Storm yet, so there might be something way more obvious. Next quotation. He for some time attended the seances of distinguished mediums, hoping that the clumsy tricks of these gentlemen would make him altogether blah blah blah. Obviously, the Dylan reference here I'm thinking of is the song Went to See the Gypsy. Of particular note is that the gypsy in Dylan's song and the mediums, all of them, in the book are male. And if you hear a song title, whether it's Dylan or anyone else, and that is titled and begins with Went to See the Gypsy, I think it's fair to say we would all imagine a woman gypsy. So maybe that means something. Probably not. But anyway, next quotation. This one is neat. The one in dirty, evil-looking rags, and the other attired in the regulation uniform of a man about town, trim, glossy, and eminently well-to-do. All right, come on, you've got to admit, it's not just that someone dressed in rags in this Victorian horror novel here makes us, of course, think of that incredible phrase, Napoleon in rags, but in this one piece of a sentence from this book, you have the juxtaposition that is so central to Dylan's masterpiece, Like a Rolling Stone. In the book, you have this one character who's a very well-heeled London gentleman, and then he encounters another, someone he knows who used to be of his class, but is now in rags. Wouldn't it be amazing if this book and that part, that one line, played a role in the start of that song? Anyway, once upon a time, I don't know what he believes now, but if we take him at his word, during his Christian phase, obviously Dylan did believe in the literal devil. And in the book, The Great God Pan, there's this concept that the devil is here, active, he's an active agent here on Earth. And here's a great little phrase. There was a piece of writing in the book called Memoirs to Prove the Existence of the Devil. But clearly there's so much that he could have taken and did from just, the Bible and just much more direct sources once he went all in temporarily, unlike fundamentalist Christianity. That I'm not going to try to pick that apart or link it to song. I think it just rhymes with something he would come to later believe, I guess. Come to think of it, not that we know when he first read The Great God Pan, though. So anyway, let's go ahead and leave our illustration of the devil up while we do the next quotation, because it's a callback to an earlier one. This is just reinforcing that maybe this concept of voids and forms came from this book. Here we go. Manifested under human flesh, that which is without form, taking to itself a form. And that is it. That's the last one. There is one important point I want to make, though, in terms of inspiration, and this kind of jibes with something we said earlier, where it would be classic Dylan to make us think or let us assume that source A must have been his inspiration when it was really something far more obscure. Remember that? In that regard, I don't think there's any doubting that his song, which I've already covered on my channel, My Own Version of You, was highly influenced by Frankenstein. So hey, full circle, back to Frankenstein. Well, Dylan, as a child of the 50s, no doubt loved the classic adaptation from Hollywood that we're seeing a still of here. But remember, I said earlier in the video that the book The Great God Pan is definitely a literary descendant of Frankenstein, because it has a mad scientist. It even has kind of the scientist in his laboratory and someone laying on the slab in an experiment. What if The Great God Pan plays somewhat into this as well? Like Dylan kind of cheekily to himself laughed, knowing that no one would think of that scene from one of his favorite books and would only think of the much more obvious Frankenstein reference. And finally, at a much higher level, if you're saying, what can we pluck from the overall book? as far as seeing how it mirrors Dylan's beliefs or vice versa. Well, I guess I'd say at the heart of the book is this notion, a truly ancient one, that humans shouldn't meddle in things beyond them. And the bookend to that is that, and this is something Dylan returns to a lot, I'm showing different songs that touch on this in their lyrics, that there's evil in the world and it's because of us, even though there is an active agent maybe in the other world. But we're the reason for how bad things are here, and this is a world just full of, sinners and corruption. Not to give too much away, but in The Great God Pan, the mad scientist kind of opens the gate inadvertently and lets in an evil, and it was his sin of pride that led him to do that. The song License to Kill really touches on all of this in particular, but as mentioned, these thoughts are sprinkled throughout Dylan's career. So that's my attempt to tie something from the overarching theme of the book to Dylan's mindset, as seen in his lyrics anyway. The ebook is nice and cheap, and it's a fun little read, and apparently some great writers, including Bob Dylan, were influenced by it. The Great God Pan by Arthur Machen. And thanks for watching.